Well, welcome back to class, everybody. This is our final module for this class for this summer. This is part B of module 3, and I hope that you have enjoyed this class. Hope that you've learned a little bit. I know that we've moved really fast through this summer class, but I hope that you have enjoyed being here in this class. Hope that you have learned quite a bit, and we're going to be talking today about the last part of cognitive behavior theory. And that's what we're talking about in this last module. CBT kind of fits very nicely with a behavior mod class like this class, just because it is an example of a behavioral approach to working with people and their problems. Albert Ellis developed cognitive behavior theory out of behavior theory basically back in the 1950s and 60s and into the 1970s. And today it is just a widely used helping approach. We see it in all kinds of ways. And I know for many of us who have graduate degrees in social work or counseling, many of us were introduced to cognitive behavior theory as a entry-level kind of a teaching theory, a way to help us learn how to become counselors and help people. And so that may be true for many of you as you go forward in your education. You may see cognitive behavior theory again as you move forward. Just a real quick word of announcement. Don't forget that the CBT case study is due on Monday, July the 6th by noon. And that also on the 6th at noon is when quiz number 3 opens up. And quiz 3, like the other two quizzes, will be open for 48 hours from noon on the 6th to noon on the 8th. Once you have that case study due, once you have that quiz done, you're done. Class is wrapped up. I'll have final grades posted here a couple of days after class ends, and you'll be good to go. So just as a real quick word of review, cognitive behavior theory was developed by a man named Albert Ellis. It was developed at a time when psychoanalytic theory was the predominant helping approach of the day. And psychoanalytic theory, if you've ever taken me for the counseling theories class, I think that psychoanalytic theory, Freud's original helping approach, really taught us so much. And even today in modern day helping, the year 2020, we still use a lot of core ideas out of psychoanalytic theory. But like every helping approach, it has its pros and its cons. And one of the things that is a knock on psychoanalytic theory is, one, it's not the only, but one of the knocks is that is it possible that that approach just makes things sometimes too complicated? Because it is a complicated approach, and it approaches people and their behavior and their problems from kind of a multi-layered, complex way. And so Albert Ellis was trained in psychoanalytic theory. And one of the things that he just believed and became to believe as a young therapist was that it oftentimes was just too complicated. And Ellis believed that you could apply rational solutions to people's problems, that people's problems and struggles were not always super complicated. There were times when he could apply rational or common sense or behavioral here and now kind of approaches, and people could learn to overcome their struggles and learn to grow and learn to find solutions for whatever it is that they were kind of struggling with. So he began to develop what today we call cognitive behavior theory, what was referred to originally as rational emotive behavior therapy, REBT. Also, too, just an interesting piece about CBT, Albert Ellis developed this theory really as he reflected on his own life. And he realized that even though as a young man he was very successful, had his PhD in his 30s, and he was a well-known therapist and researcher and professor, and he graduated from a prestigious university, but yet he struggled internally with all these feelings of low self-worth and insecurity and fear and anxiety. And you couldn't maybe tell that on the outside, but on the inside he had all these struggles. And he began to kind of reflect on that and begin to wonder, well, I wonder what that's all about. Why is it that I'm like that? And he began to realize that he held the many unhealthy, irrational beliefs. In his mind, there was this little voice in his head that was always talking to him, saying, hey, be careful, take it easy, play it safe, right? And you can't do this, you'll fail, what'll happen if you, all those kind of little conversations that he would have in his head. And he became preoccupied with this idea of our beliefs and the idea that our thoughts, the way in which we talk to ourselves, our cognitive behavior, is a huge factor in how we feel and what we do. And he was really one of the first kind of theorists to sort of propose this idea that the way in which we talk to ourselves, our beliefs, are powerful in our emotions and our behavior. He also proposed too that you and I could learn to identify and listen for those beliefs and then to modify those beliefs as well too, which we're going to talk about here in this module. So real quickly, he developed CBT and the core beliefs, 4 core beliefs of CBT that I want you to be familiar with. Like I said before, this is a very, very commonly used helping approach, even in our modern world of counseling today. And we talked in the last module that number 1, cognitive behavior theory starts with the idea of cognition. You can't understand CBT unless you understand the idea of thinking, beliefs, thoughts, perceptions, attitude, mindset, self-talk, whatever words you want to use. And Ellis believed, and this theory teaches, that we're always talking to ourselves. There's always a conversation happening in our mind. We may not be aware of it, but it's there. So it starts there. You can't understand CBT unless you understand this idea that we're always talking to ourselves. Oftentimes we don't realize we're talking to ourselves because that conversation is often quick and quiet. Oftentimes it's there, it's silent, but it's automatic. We oftentimes are talking to ourselves, but that conversation is oftentimes quiet. It's there, but we just don't notice it or don't hear it oftentimes. Secondly, it's quick. It happens, the way in which we talk to ourselves happens very, very quickly because our brain is very, very fast, and that's the way it's wired. And so we oftentimes are not aware that we are talking to ourselves, but we are. It's core idea number 1. Core idea number 2 is this A, B, and C, kind of a little bit of a new twist on A, B, C that we learned about back in an earlier part of our class. Activating event, beliefs, and consequences, emotional and behavioral consequences. Ellis taught and teaches us through CBT that a lot of times when we are talking to ourselves, it is in response to something happening around us, an activating event. Activating event can be another person, can be an event, it could be the weather, it could be something even inside of us. It's very similar to the idea of an antecedent. And the idea is something happens around us, that's A, and we talk to ourselves about it. That's B, beliefs. We're having conversations in our mind, often quickly and quietly, about what's happening around us. That's B. A, then B. And how we talk to ourselves, or B, influences how we feel and what we do. Emotional and behavioral consequences. Key idea is that beliefs come first. Beliefs come before feelings and behavior is the idea, key idea there too. Activating event, beliefs, consequences. That's the second core idea. Here's the third core idea, and the third core idea is connected to B, if I can just say it that way. The third core idea is not connected to A, activating event, or to C, emotional and behavioral consequences. The third core idea of this theory is focused on B, and it's this. Ellis, from his own experiences in his own life, realized that he had an unhealthy tendency, and it was this, to engage in negative self-talk. So he proposes, this theory teaches that for all of us, even on our best day, even those of us who tend to be more positive people, that if we aren't careful, there's an easy trap we fall into, and it is unhealthy, negative, irrational self-talk. It's a trap that we fall into. It's our unhealthy tendency, and it's to engage in negative self-talk. So it's easier for us to be negative thinkers than positive thinkers. That's the third core idea from this theory, is our unhealthy tendency, negative self-talk. So 2 things to talk about with negative self-talk. Number 1, just real quickly, and again, as I've said before several times in these little mini lectures, I want you to look at the lecture notes that I posted for you. I've written up some good notes for you to kind of review that kind of summarizes what I'm sort of teaching here in this video. Also, too, there are some PowerPoint slides for you to look at as well, and just to give you some more information about kind of what we're talking about here. But I want to talk to you a little bit about where does our unhealthy negative thinking come from? So here's our unhealthy tendency. Our unhealthy tendency is to engage in negative self-talk. Well, what's that all about? Where does that come from? Well, several ideas. Number 1, sometimes our negative self-talk is influenced by where we've come from. So through past experiences and through our childhood especially, we sometimes pick up messages, and we pick up beliefs, and we pick up truths that are not always healthy or good for us. Now, the idea is this: we are always learning from our experiences. Okay, so we're always influenced by and how we look at the world through the environment that we've grown up in. That's not always a bad thing. but sometimes it can be. And one of the things that we know is that sometimes if many of us have been through maybe some unhealthy or negative or traumatic events or chaotic upbringing or family life or whatever it may be, it's very, very possible that we may have picked up some unhealthy, irrational, unrealistic belief systems that come from our background. So our early life experiences. The example I always use is, and you can imagine this, if you as a young child had multiple experiences where the people who were supposed to protect you did not protect you. Maybe you had multiple experiences where the people who you were supposed to rely on let you down. Well, if you are, as a young person, had multiple experiences like that, it wouldn't be uncommon at all for us to begin thinking, if I'm that person, yeah, you can't trust people. Hey, you can't, people just say to you whatever they want to. People let you down. You got to be careful. Don't let yourself get hurt, right? So from those experiences, we learn truths. We learn beliefs from those experiences. It doesn't mean those beliefs are good for us, but it would not be uncommon for us to hold on to those beliefs. Kind of related to that is this. Sometimes people, many of us grew up in situations where we learn from experiences, but also too, where we received both spoken and unspoken messages. And if you take the family intervention class, we sometimes talk about how families have rules, and families have secrets, and families have messages, spoken and unspoken, right? Some of those are healthy. Some of them are not always healthy. And so sometimes as children especially, or maybe even in our younger years, maybe we've had some things said to us. Maybe some people have said some things to us, or they've implied some things to us. Maybe they've told us we're not very smart, or they've told us that all we do is mess everything up, or they've told us that we're ugly, or they've told us that whatever it may be, right? They tell us that over and over again. There's an old saying that says, anything that someone tells you over and over again, eventually you'll begin to believe it. Many, many years ago, I had a student who shared with me in private that when she was a child growing up, she was told over and over again by her parents that she was not wanted when she was born. She was an unexpected pregnancy. And she said, my parents told me over, and when they would get frustrated with me, they would say, you weren't even supposed to be born. And so she said, I was told that out loud over and over again. You weren't even supposed to be born. She said, eventually, once I heard that over and over and over again, she said, I went into my adulthood believing that I really wasn't that important. I wasn't even supposed to be here. And she said, I eventually began to internalize that belief system and had all kinds of feelings of insecurity and all kinds of self-worth issues and all kinds of anger, all kinds. She said, because I kind of believed in my mind that I wasn't even supposed to be born, right? Because I was told that over and over and over again. So sometimes, as Ellis kind of learned from his experience with his mother, as I mentioned last week, sometimes our mind tape records messages. And if we're not careful, we play them over and over and over and over again. So sometimes our unhealthy thinking comes from some of the messages, unhealthy messages that we've heard. Also, too, sometimes our culture and our society can send us messages. And we pick those up and we begin to believe certain messages that aren't healthy and good for us, that are kind of related to just the world that we live in. We live in a world that sort of promotes materialism, and we live in a world that promotes certain gender norms and certain norms about appearance and attraction and body image and all those kinds of things. We kind of live in a world that sort of teaches and promotes, oftentimes many, many truths and beliefs that really are not good for us, and they're really not true. But we pick them up and we believe them if we're not careful, right? So our society and our culture also too can oftentimes teach us unhealthy belief systems that are just not good for us, and so that can influence our negative self-talk. And then lastly, just our own personal just unique personality. Many of us are our own worst enemies, right? We just within ourselves, just the way in which we look at the world, the way in which we talk to ourselves. If we're not careful, we may be real perfectionistic. We may be real hard on ourselves. We may be real controlling or domineering. Just naturally through our natural personality is kind of who we are, right? And sometimes that can sometimes get us in trouble. And so if we're not careful, we may hold certain belief systems. A lot of people who are real perfectionistic, have kind of this belief system that everything has to be a certain way, and I have to be a certain way, or else, people will not love me, people will not accept me, or whatever it may be, right? So sometimes, our negative self-talk and thinking can be influenced and is influenced by lots and lots and lots of things. So that's the first thing I want to mention. Second thing I want to mention to you is this. I want to give you some examples of how negative self-talk can sound. Now, it can sound a bunch of different ways, but just really, really quickly, let me just kind of visit with you a little bit about just some common ways that our negative self-talk can sound. And again, it can sound a bunch of different ways. Number one of the things that Ellis realized, what he realized and kind of wrote much about in his research and developing of CBT, is what are called the three musts. And the three musts are actually beliefs that Albert Ellis realized he believed in his own mind, and he had to kind of learn to kind of get over, that he had kind of picked up from his childhood. And in my experience personally, these are common, these three musts are common for many, many people. Here's what they are. Number one, I must do well for people to love me. Number two, I must have the approval and acceptance of people in order to feel good about myself. Number three, life must be fair. Three beliefs that really in actuality are not accurate. Number one, I must do well in order for people to love and accept me. This performance mentality that many of us have. I have to do well for people to like me, for people to love me. I must do well. It's just not true. You and I should not base our self-esteem on the approval or acceptance of other people. It's easy to do, but it's just not healthy for us, right? Second one's kind of related. I must have the approval and acceptance of other people in order to feel good about myself. Many people, may say, well, I don't believe that, but they act like it. And in actuality, through our behavior, we realize, we sort of teach and realize, hey, we do believe that. Others must treat me well if I'm to feel good about myself. Well, the reality is we don't have control over other people. So as long as I'm basing my self-esteem on how other people treat me, I'm just always going to be in trouble. I'm just going to be setting myself up for defeat. And then the last one's a big one. Life must be fair. Many, many, many people struggle with that idea that, hey, my life is supposed to be perfect. Hey, my life is supposed to be problem-free. Hey, my life is supposed to be fair. Well, life is not perfect. Life is not fair. It's just not. It's not wired to be that way. It's not intended to be that way. But if I live with a mentality that says, well, life is supposed to be fair, then when it isn't fair, I'm going to feel like a victim. And I'm going to convince myself I'm a victim because I have the mindset that says life must be fair. So those three musts. I remember being taught those many, many, many years ago, and those have stuck with me. And in my experience, in my own life, and my experience in doing counseling, I have found through the years that many people struggle with those three musts. I must do well if others are to love and accept me. Others must treat me well if I'm going to feel good about myself. And lastly, life must be fair. And so those are three really, really simple, basic examples of how unhealthy, negative self-talk can kind of sound. So I want to give you that as an example. Also, too, I posted for you in the module this week a handout on ANTS. And ANTS is an acronym that stands for Automatic Negative Thoughts and Statements. This is another core way of understanding how negative self-talk can and does sound. I want to encourage you to look at that handout. I give you 7 or 8 examples, common examples of general tendencies that we call ANTS. For example, I love the phrase catastrophizing or awfulizing. Catastrophizing and awfulizing is a cognitive tendency where in my life I make everything terrible. In my mind, I tell myself everything is terrible. This is awful. This is horrible. This is terrible, right? If you were a counselor and you were using CBT with clients, you might ask a client, hey, I want you to pay attention. Do you ever tell yourself something's horrible? I want you to start listening for that in your mind. Do you ever say the word terrible? Do you ever say the word awful? A lot of times we overreact. We just overreact negatively. This is horrible. This is terrible. This is awful. In other words, this is a catastrophe. Catastrophizing or awfulizing is a common, unhealthy thinking tendency that we kind of fall into if we're not careful. It's one example. Another one is what's called personalization. Personalization is where in my mind, I convince myself that I am to blame for other people's problems. I convince myself in my mind that I am to blame for other people's behavior. and I put myself in the middle of other people's situations, called personalization. That's very, by the way, people who struggle with low self-esteem or who struggle with what we call codependency, many times if you use CBT and working with them, they often personalize lots of things. In their mind, they convince themselves or try to convince themselves, this is about me. When lots of things in life are not about us. In fact, most things in life are not about us. Okay, but we put ourselves in the middle of situations oftentimes and we personalize. So personalization is a common ant. It's a common example of how negative self-talk oftentimes can sound. Overgeneralization would be another example. It's a third one. So it would be like an example where someone, where I in my mind may say, use words like always and never. He always acts this way. This will never work out. That kind of language. Where we're basically taking one single thing and we're overgeneralizing it, right? So overgeneralization is another common way, it's a common example of how negative self-talk can sound, is overgeneralizing. What's called mind reading. Mind reading is a phrase that Albert Ellis came up with to kind of refer to this tendency in our mind where we convince ourselves we know what other people are thinking. And you may say, well, I never do that. We probably all do that. We say, well, yeah, I know she. Well, yeah, I know you. And we assume, and it's what we call an assumption error. An assumption error is where we assume that we know what someone else is going to do, or what someone else is thinking, or what someone else is saying, what someone else is feeling, and we kind of mind read, as we would say. It's a very common struggle. It's a very common unhealthy thinking process, thinking error, you might say, that we see oftentimes in relationships especially. But mind reading is something we have to be kind of careful about. Fortune telling is a fifth one. Fortune telling is where, similar to mind reading, it's sort of an assumption error. It's where we assume in our mind that we are convinced we know what's going to happen next. We say, well, you know what's going to happen next, then I'm going to get fired, or you know what's going to happen next, then I'm just going to get an F, or on this exam. We sort of jump to an assumption that we know, and usually it's a negative assumption, that something's going to happen next. And we don't always know what's going to happen next, but we convince ourselves that we know that what's going to happen next because somehow we know how to control, and we can see into the future. Well, we don't know, and we can't have control over everything. We can't see in the future. But oftentimes we think like we do, and it's a common mistake we make. Another one would be what's called all or nothing or black and white thinking, and this is kind of the real rigid, all good, all bad, all terrible, all awesome, just real black and white, no room for gray. People are either this way or this way. So anytime you and I label people or we stereotype people, it's kind of an example of what we call all or nothing thinking, where we say, well, there's this group of people and there's this group of people. There's no room for gray. Usually when we don't allow ourselves any room for gray is where we get in trouble, because it's just not accurate, because there's lots of gray in the world. And so all or nothing or black and white thinking. Discounting the positives is another one. A couple more here. Discounting the positives is another common ant. I'm sure none of us have ever done this. And it's where we ignore all the good things that are going on and we focus on just all the bad things that are going on. And we get over focused in our mind on one thing that's not going well, and we ignore all the good things, right? The example I always use, again, I'm sure none of you have ever done this. Have you ever gotten an exam back and you got a 90-something, like a 97 or a 96 or a 98? You missed one question. And what do? You dig and you look for that one question that you missed, and if you're not careful, you let that one question bother you all day. You got 42 questions right and you got one wrong. And if we're not careful, we get focused on the one thing we got wrong. It's called discounting the positives. We kind of kick ourselves and beat up on ourselves in our mind for not getting everything right? So that's kind of an example of both all or nothing thinking and discounting the positives. Shoulds and oughts. Shoulds and oughts is another example of an ant, and that's shoulds and oughts is where you and I, if we're not careful, we get over focused on what should have happened or what ought to happen or what we should do or ought to do. And we get over focused on the ideal in an imperfect world. She should, I ought to, I should have, or whatever. Maybe if we're not careful, we get over focused on shoulds and oughts. And sometimes, when we use CBT, we're going to talk in the next video about cognitive restructuring. And one of the ways we can help people to begin to catch themselves and to notice their negative self-talk is to give them some key words like should and ought, or always and never, or the next one we'll talk about name calling in just a second. That as a way for people to start catching themselves and kind of catching their negative self-talk is to listen for certain words. Remember, that self-talk is always there. It's always going on. We just don't always realize it, always notice it, right? So shoulds and oughts is where someone is over-focused in their mind on something that they should have done or someone else should have done. Should and ought, right? If we're not careful, we get kind of hung up on this. I shared, and some of you had a class with me last semester. You heard this story many years ago. I had a student who was in recovery, and he was faithful to his 12-step program, and he took the behavior mod class with me. And whenever we talked about shoulds and oughts, he shared in class one day this experience. He said, when I got into AA, he said my sponsor had to help me kind of get over all of me beating up on myself, and he said I would talk to my sponsor about how, you know what I should have done? I should have gone to college. You know what I should have done? I should have done this. You know what I should have done? I should have done all this stuff looking over my shoulder. He said, looking over my shoulder, beating up on myself. Well, I should have. Well, I should have. Well, I should have. And he said, my sponsor said to me one day, look at it this way. If you should have, you would have, but you didn't. So move on, right? I kind of like that. If you should have, you would have, but you didn't. So move on. And I thought that was a great little example of how, it's an example of how shoulds and oughts can get us in trouble. A lot of times with shoulds and oughts, we're thinking about the past or with ourselves or someone else. Well, he should have, well, I should have. And we just can't get bogged down with that, right? The last one is name calling. I'm sure none of you has a pet name for yourself. I'm sure none of you do. I'm sure none of you ever call yourself idiot or stupid or dummy or whatever or something else. If we're not careful, we have some pet names for ourselves. And in our mind, when we're frustrated with ourselves, we'll call ourselves some negative, pejorative kind of word as a put down. Or we'll call other people names, but usually it's calling myself a name, a negative, put down, critical name. And we have to learn to let go of those names, and because they're not helpful, they're not useful. All they do is they're just us beating up on ourselves. So name calling is it's a last example of a common automatic negative thought or statement. All those ants are just, that kind of goes with the 3 musts. Those are just examples, really simple examples of how negative self-talk oftentimes can and does sound. So this is our unhealthy tendency. This is core idea number 3. Our unhealthy tendency from CBT is that not only are we always talking to ourselves, unfortunately, we are always talking to ourselves in unhealthy, negative, unrealistic, or irrational ways. So that's what this theory would say is at the core of our problems. I gave you in the lecture, and we're going to end this little video on this statement. This little statement I gave you in the lecture notes at the top of core idea number 3 is a good one. It says this: it isn't what happens to us that creates our distress. It's what we believe or tell ourselves about those events. Every single theory has a core idea as far as where our problems come from. This theory, CBT's belief, is that most of our problems are right here, in between our ears, the way in which we talk to ourselves. We often talk to ourselves in unrealistic, negative, irrational ways. And all that does is just create within us unhealthy, negative emotions, and it puts us in a position to make poor choices. Because again, remember, our thinking influences how we feel and what we do. So the old phrase that says, garbage in, garbage out. So if all I'm doing is telling myself how terrible I am, well, how is that going to affect my emotions and my choices? Not in good ways. Probably not, right? So this is our unhealthy tendency. One more little video I want you to look at has to do with core idea number 4, the ability you and I have to change our minds. All right, have a good one. See you next time.